Welcome to Spirit Matters, where we explore matters of the spirit with leading experts from across the spiritual spectrum, all designed to enrich and enlarge your wisdom, deepen your joy and peace, and awaken your inner connection to the divine. Here's your host, Philip Goldberg.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at Spirit Matters. We have ongoing, interesting, and inspiring conversations with very wise people who will help you along your own spiritual path. I should say, for newcomers, please subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss one. Take a look at the previous interviews that keep piling up every 10 days or so, and take full advantage of them. And if you're inclined, look at spiritmatterstalk.com, where you'll see the previous life of this podcast, that the one I co-hosted with Dennis Ramundi for 7 years. You'll find a few hundred interviews there, all free.
Wow.
And some of the people here we interview now on this new platform, you'll find earlier versions of on the old podcast. And today is no exception. I'm really happy to have my good friend James Finley, if you will, with us today. James is a clinical psychologist, spiritual director, a faculty member at the Center for Action and Contemplation, and a core teacher with the Living School, both of those organizations founded by Father Richard Rohr. Early in his life, and we'll talk about this, Jim was a cloistered monk in the Trappist monastery of Gethsemane, where he was a novice under the well-known mystic and author Thomas Merton. And after leaving the monastery, became a psychologist, a retreat leader, a workshop leader, and a recognized expert on contemplative Christianity and mysticism. He's the author of several books, including Merton's Palace of Nowhere, The Contemplative Heart, Christian Meditation, and his latest book, which is what we'll talk about mainly today, The Healing Path. I have to say that when I lived in Los Angeles all those years, Jim and I would meet on occasion for breakfast, and I never failed to come away having learned something new and also having had a good time. And we'll do both of those things today, won't we, Jim?
Yes, we will. Yes, we will, as always.
Very good. So let's look at, turn to your spiritual history. I always like to give our listeners, especially those who are unfamiliar with the guest, a sense of their personal spiritual journey. And in this case, your personal story is so much a part of your new book, The Healing Path, which you subtitle A Memoir and an Invitation, that it's pertinent in different and more illuminating ways. So there's, rather than just make it a general question, there's early in your path, there were three maybe turning points, if you will. One was you entered a monastery when you graduated high school. This was not a typical choice for high school graduates in the early 1960s. So one of the questions I'll ask you to address is why you made that decision, and then why the decision of the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. Was it because Thomas Merton was there, or was that just luck? And the third is, why did you leave after 6 years and eventually choose the path of psychotherapist instead? So with that framework, tell us about your past.
Yes. Well, I think the story of it is in my own life. I was born and raised in Akron, Ohio. I was the oldest of 6 children. My father was a violent alcoholic. My mother was a devout Catholic. A lot of their fighting was over religion, actually.
Mm.
And when she would take us to Mass on Sunday, she would ask us to pray, ask God for the strength to get through the things that happen when Daddy gets mad. That's how she put it. And so it was very violent, starting at age 3, really towards me, physically violent, emotionally violent toward my brothers. He sexually abused my sister. It was a painful thing, really. And so my faith was a kind of something to hold on to that got me through all of that, because I could tell it was that for her too. And so as I was going through all of that, I was in the 9th grade, and I went to an all-boys Catholic high school, and the instructor talked about monasteries. I'd never heard of monasteries before. And he described monasteries as places where people go to seek and find and give themselves to God for their own salvation, but also believing that fidelity touches the whole world in ways we don't understand. And he mentioned Thomas Merton. I'd never heard of Thomas Merton before. And he explained that Thomas Merton, at 28 years old, left a promising career at Columbia University in literature and the arts, had this deep conversion experience, and became this cloistered monk, entered the monastery, which is at the Abbey of Gethsemane Monastery, and a Cistercian order founded in the 11th century by Bernard of Clairvaux, which based on the rule of St. Benedict in the 5th century. So it's an ancient monastic contemplative cloistered life. And so that day after school, I went up to the school library. They had one book by Merton there, The Sign of Jonas, which is a journal he wrote as a monk. And on the very first page, I was 14 years old when I read this. Merton said, as for me, I have but one desire, the desire for solitude, to disappear into the secret of God's face. And at 14, I didn't know what that meant, but something in me didn't, said me too. And so for the 4 years of high school, the violence got worse. The depth and the beauty of Merton's words about God and the presence of God and the life really sustained me to the point that I felt called that I wanted to enter the monastery. And my master plan was I would sit at Merton's feet and he would guide me into this deep experience. And so when I graduated, my father didn't know I wanted to go to the monastery. So when I graduated, he didn't go to my graduation. He was drunk. And so I went out and I told him I wanted to go to the monastery. And he wanted to know what a monastery was. I explained it as best I could. And he said, if you go to that place, I'll kill your mother to punish you. He said, that's not a threat. I'll kill her. And I walked away. I left the next morning. I was used to that, this world I lived in. So I entered the monastery, and Merton at this time was well known because after he entered the monastery, he wrote his autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain, after Dante's Paradise is a 7-story mountain. And it went on the New York Times bestsellers list. And he went on to write many books in contemplative spirituality, also in social justice, the Seeds of Destruction and Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. So it was against the Vietnam War, against nuclear armament, pro Dr. Martin Luther King. He was a poet. He was also very active in interfaith dialogue. So the Jewish philosopher and mystic Abraham Joshua Heschel came to visit him. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh came to visit him from Vietnam. He had a very deep involvement with mystical Islam, with the Sufi tradition. A yogi came from India to found an ashram. I tried to find the name of that yogi. I couldn't find it. You probably know who it was. And if I said his name, you might. So anyway, he came and we went up to Merton's Hermitage. We did the postures and the breathing together. So he introduced me to this interfaith, contemplative, mystical lineage. And I lived. There was a monk. It was a cloistered life of chanting the Psalms, simplicity, and prayer. And he led me in the guidance of the classical texts of the mystics, Christian and non-Christian. I had a chance to study medieval metaphysics and philosophy, Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure, and it had a profound effect on me. And he was my teacher. Merton was as novice master, he guided me along this path.
I want to interrupt for 1 second, Jim. As you said, Merton by then was very famous, but he chose to stay in the monastery, and he wrote there and had these famous correspondences with spiritual teachers from all the traditions. It would seem to me that a monastically inclined young man who was drawn to the monks' way of life, that many of them would want to be at Gethsemane under Merton.
Right.
So how was it you were chosen?
Well, the thing is when he wrote when he wrote Seven Storey Mountain, the Second World War was going on, and the book touched a lot of people with a sense of hope. And people would come back from the war, entering the monastery. So I don't know how many monks were there. It was really through his writing, maybe 200 or 300 monks were there. So they founded daughter houses. They sent monks out to found different monasteries in the United States. So a lot of people were drawn there because of him, and I was one of them.
Yeah.
When I entered, I had to be interviewed by the novice master and the abbot. John Hughes Bamberger was a monk. He was also a psychiatrist. They interviewed me, and I got accepted out of high school. So I went and entered, and there Merton was, and
wonderful, yeah,
changed my life, yeah. So that's how that happened. And by the way, just to jump ahead too with Merton, he later on, when he got interested in interfaith dialogue, he was invited by the Dalai Lama to come exchange with dialogue with him. There was an interfaith dialogue in Bangkok, Thailand. He got permission to go, and while on that trip, December the 10th, 1968, he met with the Dalai Lama. He was at this conference, and he was electrocuted there, Bangkok, Thailand. And there were rumors the CIA killed him because there were rumors about Martin Luther King and all this stuff, whether it was accidental. So he's 53 years old, same day Karl Barth died, the theologian, 53 years old. So he was just one of these bigger than life gifted people that touched many people's lives, and I was one of them. And so then later also, I'm jumping ahead, but then when I did leave the monastery, I wrote a book called Merton's Palace of Nowhere, Ultimate Identity Beyond the Ego. And I was married, and that's what started me leading silent meditation retreats around the United States and Canada. And out of that, I was offered a scholarship for a PhD in clinical psychology if I would explore the contribution of the mystical lineages to mental health. And I got my doctorate and went into full-time practice and so on. So
why, I want to backtrack a second. Why the decision after 6 years to leave the monastery?
Yeah, I didn't want to leave. I was very much at home there. If I had stayed 2 more years, I would have made solemn vows. I would have been ordained. I would have gone to Rome for further studies and come back. But what happened with me is I was sexually abused by one of the monks, who was my confidant, and I had a breakdown. And so I didn't tell the abbot, I didn't tell Merton, I didn't tell John Hughes. I had no refuge. I just left. Dropped out of the church, came home, and I got married. First woman I ever dated, I married her. It was an ill-fated marriage. And I dropped out of the church because I couldn't see how God could buy into an outfit like that. I was so traumatized. So I would get up early in the morning and do a quiet time. I'd do yoga. Merton introduced me to yoga and to Zazen. And then what happened is I started reading Merton's writings out loud, the same way that I would read the sutras. And I was drawn back into kind of mystical Catholicism, mystical Christianity. And it kind of changed my life. And I'd like to read a famous little passage by Merton.
Please.
To get an idea how he talked, how he wrote. This is in a little book he wrote called Thoughts in Solitude. This is Merton. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I'm actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore will I trust you always, though I may seem to be lost in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. That's Merton. So
I could see where, given the traumatic circumstances of your childhood and your adolescence, that would be a guiding light kind of thing. But now I'm curious, Jim, you talk about how faith got you through during those years with a violent father and so forth. And I have to say that reading your memoir, the stories are horrific and heartbreaking. But you say that faith got you through. At the same time, we all know people for whom suffering and injustice and the unfairness of life and trauma do the opposite. They pull them away from faith. It pulls them away from anything connected with belief in God or anything like that. In your case, it did the opposite. How do you explain the two different directions that trauma could take people?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I say this as a psychotherapist. You can see why people were traumatized. It's like, how could God let this happen?
Yes.
To me, how could it even be real and let that happen? I understand that. You could see how people would do that. And everyone has to walk their own walk and so on. For me, where I was at with this is that I say that God is a presence that protects us from nothing, even as God unexplainably sustains us in all things.
Now, that was a line in the book that I underlined and was going to ask you about. So please elaborate.
Okay. So whatever it means that God takes care of us, Jesus says, without me, you can do nothing. Taking care of it. It doesn't mean that God takes care of us as in preventing the cruel thing, the unfair thing. In Christian terms, it's the mystery of the cross. There's no promises. It isn't promised that we're taken care of at that level. But I would say in faith, God depends on us to do our best to be a nurturing, protective person and to protect others. Grounded in a peace is not dependent on the outcome of our efforts, because maybe by human standards, it'll go down in flames, really. And so for me, what it was for me, I think, is that when I was little, it was just my experience, one of my earliest experiences, I was maybe 5 years old. I was lying in bed at night in the dark. I was listening to my father beat my mother outside the door. And I was sad, I remember, because maybe earlier that day he hit me or yelled at me. And so I took my mother's words to heart and I prayed to ask God for the strength to get through this. And to me, how I put it, in a moment I can't remember, God heard my prayer, came to me in the dark and merged with me. That was my experience. So then when I woke up the next morning, it was much better because the violence went on. But my father, when he thought he was hitting me, he was hitting that other little boy that people can see. He didn't know the real me was taken by God into a secret place he didn't know about. Later, years later, when I became a psychotherapist, I learned that I was dissociating. All the religious imagery of my mother to give meaning to dissociating. And years later in therapy, I had to learn not to depend on dissociating. But the fact I was dissociating doesn't mean God did not merge with me, sustain me, and guide me. That's the subtle mystery of faith.
When you hear the word dissociate, it sounds like a almost pathological kind of diagnosis. In my experience, it's fascinating because I have seen descriptions of psychiatric descriptions of dissociation that sound very much like the mystical experience of witnessing, what the yogis call witnessing, that sense of having an identity that's more than, beyond the identification with the body and the personality and stuff. So how do we understand when something like that can be debilitating in some way, and when it can be understood as a desirable spiritual experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. And sometimes the same word can have very different meanings based on the context.
Yeah.
So I want to give it first in the meaning of the mystical traditions. This would be Buddhism or yoga. It could be Kabbalah, Jewish, anything. These mystical traditions say that we're walking around in a dissociative state, and that we're exiled from the divinity of every breath and heartbeat. That ultimately speaking, just one thing is happening, that the infinite presence of God is presencing itself and pouring itself out and giving itself to us in and as the intimate immediacy of our very presence, the presence of others in all things. So to really, 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 really see all that we really are, we'd see that if the generosity of the infinite is infinite, and we are the generosity of God. We are the song God sings, but our capacity to realize it is traumatized. So spiritual awakening, faith in spiritual awakening, is actually learning not to be dissociated off from the divinity of every moment and to live by it. And another mark of the mystic is that in these mystical states, these unitive states of non-dual consciousness, the temptation might be, because it's beyond the darkness of this world, like I'm out of here, I'm off into a celestial realm. But really what it does is it radicalizes our commitment to the world. We come back full circle to be a spiritually awakened person who walks the roads of a brutal, unfair, dark, beautiful, divine, and mysterious world. That's how Jesus lived. See? And so the relationship of mystical union to social justice or the corporal works of mercy, the mark is that it heightens a sensitivity to suffering. How can I be helpful? Like that. So dissociating then is really a heightened state of awareness that heals us from being dissociated off from the divinity of awareness itself. Put it pathologically, dissociation. There's a book I used to use with my patients in therapy. It helped me. There's a book by Judith Herman called Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder.
Complex post-traumatic
stress disorder. And what it is, what the diagnosis is that when we're traumatized, especially as children, and repeatedly traumatized as children, is that trauma takes three forms, that we internalize it as adults. One is somatic disorders, eating disorders and so on. It gets ritualistically reenacted through the body. The other is the personality disorders, like borderline splitting, like intense reactions of rage and so on. And the other is dissociative disorders. And the person is dissociated off from the immediacy of their experience to survive. See? So that when they were little, dissociating saved their life, but you get trapped in it. And you grow up as a dissociated person, which raises havoc when you try to be married to somebody. You try to be real because you're disconnected. And so really the healing and therapy is how not to rely on dissociating. See how to understand it, work through it, and integrate the fragmented, oft traumatized aspects of yourself to be more present, and hopefully out of the process to become all the wiser for it. Like deep transformative healing. So that word dissociating that has two very different meaning, but in some mysterious way they touch each other. See, that's what my book's about. What are the ways in which trauma and the presence of God meet, touch, and intermingle with each other? That place is very precarious. The trauma can flood and overwhelm not only our experience of the divine, but even we lose ourselves in trauma. But But it's also possible that sometimes out of trauma, a light shines through. See, that shines through the brokenness and sustains us in it and guides us in it. And so a lot of the way I did therapy, my whole sense of, a lot of people that came to me for therapy wanted their spirituality to be a resource in their therapy. See, how can I access the depth dimension and draw up from it the wisdom and the courage to touch the hurting places with love, like this. So that's the sense of it, I guess, for me.
When I was reading about your childhood, I was struck just by the ongoing series of traumas. It seemed like, daily trauma. And you were the oldest child, and therefore was given responsibility for, in a sense, protecting the others, which probably added to your burden. It made me curious. You, as a young boy, found grace amidst all this, and it led you on this incredible path of mystical spirituality. What about your siblings? They presumably had similar experiences. How did they fare?
I want to share a minute about myself, a decisive moment. When I was in the 7th grade, all this trauma was going on. I was the oldest of 6. And my mother came to me and she said, after you kids go to sleep and Daddy's on the kitchen drinking, he gets so angry, I'm afraid he's going to kill me. And because you're the oldest, I want you to sit at the top of the stairs and listen. And if you think he's going to murder me, I want you to run down the stairs out into the street and pound on the neighbor's door. So I would sit at the top of the stairs. Is he just choking her again? Is he just pulling her hair, killing her? And if I wait too long and he kills her, am I responsible for her death?
Yeah.
And if he beats me to the front door, will he kill me? And I sat like that every night. And then I would go into my room, close the door. I would light a little vigil light, and a little blue glass vigil light. There was a statue there of Mary, an icon of Jesus. There was the Bible. And I would turn out the lights, wrap a rosary on my hands. And I would bow over the way devout Muslims pray and touch my forehead to the floor, asking God to give me strength. And I would get in bed and go to sleep. So there was a strange interplay of this depth.
And I'm sure when you went to sleep, you were worried that you might go to sleep prematurely. And
yeah, although I have to say that it didn't dawn on me. I think it's because I would stay up until I thought it was safe. He would wind down. He would just become incoherent and go to sleep, and she'd come up. I wouldn't go to bed until I thought, that it was over. It doesn't mean he couldn't have gotten up and done something, but it never occurred to me. I don't recall ever having that thought. And so anyway, that's the way I lived. And so when I went to the monastery and lived in silence for 6 years, I think it was what had such a radical effect on me about God and having Merton to guide me and so on. As to my siblings, I have one brother. We were all traumatized, all physically traumatized by him. We were traumatized by seeing him physically traumatize my mother. And it had a lasting effect on all of us. And what happened for us really is each of us in our own way among the brothers, we were able to talk about it. We've all been through therapy, and one brother and 2 of them in Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. So actually it's been very bonding for us, I think, to process the trauma, how we moved on from the trauma, how it still can catch us sometimes. I had one brother I was very close to, and he died maybe 5 years ago. He had a very rare neurological disorder. And I was very close to him. He's kind of AA, saved his life, really. So I had a very good relationship with him. My sister, I always had a good relationship with her, but it was complicated with her with the incest.
yeah.
Because the thing is, because of the incest, she was the only one in the house he never beat. And therefore she was bonded, it formed like it was really very destructive. It was very confusing.
Oh, sure.
It was traumatized in a very different way like this. And so for that reason, we're at a place right now where we mutually agreed not to talk to each other out of respect for each other. And I respect her. She's got to walk her walk, I walk mine. And she's a good person in her own marriage and teaching yoga and with her kids and her grandkids. And, everyone's moving along in their own way. So that's the story with the siblings.
Yeah.
After I left the monastery and got married, my first marriage, my mother left my father.
Yeah.
And the last 8 years of her life, she lived in a mobile home, very active in her parish. They were the happiest years of her life, really. We used to talk a lot. And she died unexpectedly of minor heart surgery. And it was the very next day, my wife and I, Maureen, were in Maui on our vacation. And the very next day is when they flew the planes into the World Trade Center.
Oh, God.
Died of a heart attack, and they closed down all the airports. Like this,
Yeah.
we couldn't fly out.
Oh,
But
God.
she did a good life. She had her own courageous walk to walk, and she ended it by being true to herself. And that was my mother.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. It made me very curious about the rest of your family and whether they also had, in their own way, found grace. And you talk about the bittersweet alchemy between trauma and transcendence. And you also talk about patterns that sustain us through trauma, spiritual patterns. Could you elaborate on that? I know, everybody to one degree or another has been wounded in life, and that informs their path. I'm sure, our listeners can relate to one degree or another to your story, and maybe, find encouragement in the notion that there's transcendence in trauma. Please elaborate on it for them.
These are the opening sentences of my memoir. In writing these reflections, I'm inviting you to join me in following the path, the way of life, in which we're healed from all that hinders us from experiencing the steady, strong currents of divinity that flow on in the bittersweet alchemy of our lives. And so by alchemy, I don't mean the patterns where sad times give way to happy times, give way to sad times, nor do I mean the pattern where sometimes they're happening simultaneously. There's one aspect of our life we're very happy about. I don't mean that. By alchemy, I mean like the alchemist of old who tried to turn lead into gold. See, that somehow that one can be quickened from within by a grace that doesn't stop the trauma from happening, but transcends the trauma, is ribboned through the trauma unexplainably, and sustains us and carries us forward unforeseeably, as according to how our life unfolds. So how would we then, this is one way of understanding the depth dimension of psychotherapy or of deep sitting practice, how can we be healed from all that hinders us from experiencing the alchemy of that divinity that's ribboned through life itself? And having found it, how can we learn? Because once we taste it, I think we all have moments where we taste the oneness. And then what can start to happen with some of us is a desire to abide in the depths so fleetingly glimpsed. So
say that again.
It's the desire. So let's say there's a moment of oneness. It says sometimes they happen in the midst of nature. He talks about walking out alone in the midst of nature, and he said you turn to see a flock of birds descending, and as if out of the corner of your eye, you sense something in their descent that's primordial, vast, and true. Sometimes it washes over us in the arms of the beloved. Sometimes it comes to us reading a child a goodnight story. Sometimes it comes to us in a quiet hour at day's end. But from time to time, there's this hallowed sense of oneness, like, what a fool I am to worry so, like this. But it passes. But what happens in its passing is the desire to abide in the depths so fleetingly. Because there's the intuition that in these quickenings, sometimes they're very intense, actually can change your whole life, but usually they're very subtle. You get the intuition. It isn't that in those moments something more is given, but a curtain parts and the abyss-like divinity of every moment fleetingly graced your life. So how can I learn to abide in the depths so fleetingly? And that's the path talk. See, that's the journey. So this is the long journey to the ashram, or to the gates of the monastery, or to the sangha,
The gateless gate.
the gateway, exactly. Or how in
The
my own
palace of nowhere, to
the
use.
palace of nowhere. And how can I learn in my own home, watering the house plants and living my life? How can I learn to abide in the upwelling of the grace divinity of the miracle of every breath and heartbeat? And by learning to live by it, how can I learn to share it with others? By the way I treat them, the way I listen to them. And so really the book's essentially about that, really, I think. It's a word of encouragement.
Jim, in my experience, many people set foot on a spiritual path, whatever the path may be, and they're motivated by perhaps heightened experience that they get in their community, in their contemplative practices, and the promise of greater fulfillment and divinity and so forth. Often that's interpreted as, this path will end my suffering. There won't be any more of these difficulties that life has presented me until now. They'll be gone.
Yeah.
I'll be done with. That often leads to disappointment, and I'm speaking from my own experience as, a young man who set foot on the path, and remember, I read the Bhagavad Gita and said, I want what those people had. And I remember a passage that promised that the yogis have equanimity in loss and gain, and pleasure and pain, and victory and defeat. And I said, God, I want that. I'm so sick of this. And I didn't notice that it says you can have peace in the midst of pain and loss and suffering. Not that it will disappear, because we're human. Have you run into that with people as well? A disillusionment that life's difficulties continue, and that the task is to find the grace nevertheless.
Yes. By the way, I think this is built into life itself. When you get married, it's bliss.
Yeah.
Or you have a child, it's just ecstasy. It's everything has this quality where I say you despair or go deeper. And I want to share an anecdote from Buddhism rather than the Christian tradition about the middle way. There's a lovely book by Baum, Bahm, on the middle way. And here's how he put it like this. The Buddha taught that we suffer when we desire. We suffer when we have determined that the conditions necessary to be deeply happy are other than the conditions that I'm in. As long as we keep doing that, we suffer. And therefore, the Buddha said, he says, and therefore, to stop suffering, you have to stop doing that. See? Next, to the extent you desire to stop doing that more than you're actually able to stop doing that, the very desire to stop doing that will cause more suffering.
Right.
Therefore, the middle way consists of desiring to stop doing that while accepting your inability to do that, and discovering in the deep acceptance of the inability, you're being sustained by a depth that's ribboned through the conditions of life, but isn't reducible to them. I love the story about the Buddha. He had this great awakening, and for years as an itinerant preacher, he taught the Dharma into old age, and he died of accidental food poisoning. He died. And the legend is, I'll paraphrase it, is his attendants, of course, are very distraught. And they said, we're going to go tell the cook what he did. You killed the Buddha. And he said, don't do that. Our brother has enough self-esteem issues as it is. He'll be in therapy for the rest of his life if you tell him that. He said,
to speak.
Yeah, so to speak. He said, besides.
Jim, you froze.
Movie, A meal.
Back up a
Back,
little bit.
oh,
Your
yeah. The
audio
Buddha,
froze
oh,
for a
yeah, yeah.
second.
The Buddha said, besides, which is better? A meal lovingly prepared to nurture the body of the Buddha, or a meal lovingly prepared that unintentionally sent the Buddha to his final liberation? See,
Mm.
that's compassion. See,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
equal-mindedness. See,
yeah. That's great.
another image that strikes me about this too is, the stages of dying. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, like denial,
Mhm.
anger, bargaining, and death. All those first stages are the ego coming to the end of itself. She says some people come to acceptance. She says not everybody comes to it, but acceptance is freedom from the tyranny of death in the midst of death. And when you look into the face of the dying loved one, it's like the gate of heaven, really. So what is freedom from the tyranny of suffering in the midst of suffering? Freedom from the tyranny, the deathless life that never dies in the midst of a dying world. And that's the interiority that we can find our way to. Yeah.
Speaking of which, you open the book and it's deeply moving. Well, partly because I met Maureen, and you open the book with her dying, or her the days preceding her final passing. This is your beloved wife, Maureen, and it's these are very moving passages. And speaking on a personal level, I know you and I got together a few times during that period, and I remember what it was like for you. And you found grace in that loss and in an illumination in those days leading up to her passing. All of us will deal, if we haven't already, we will eventually deal with death and the loss of people very close to us. Say something about that. I'm going to I'll cue you. One of the passages in the book was, when we die, we do not go anywhere.
Yeah.
I want you to explain that.
Let me do that. Okay. Maureen and I were very close, and she was a therapist and a spiritual director, and I was that also. And we were together for 30 years, and really a blessed life. I say, two Irish Catholic with Buddhist tendencies living at the edge of the sea, and it was bliss, just real bliss. And she died of Alzheimer's, and she died in-house hospice. Her bed was right here in the living room. Her ashes, I sit there every morning right where she died, and her ashes are next to me. And my oldest daughter, who's a hospice nurse, was with me. And I wrote this the night before she died. She died the next morning. So I'll read the passage you mentioned, because it set the tone for the whole book. These reflections mark out a path, a way of life in which we as human beings may be healed from all that hinders us from experiencing the steady, strong currents of divinity that flow on in the bittersweet alchemy of our lives. As I write this introduction, I'm immersed in these intimate depths, sitting next to my beloved wife, Maureen, as she lies here dying in the final stages of Alzheimer's. Even though she is unconscious and cannot open her eyes to look at me, I believe she can hear me as I speak from my heart in whispered words. Just now I told her that the waves of unbearable pain and crying that come from time to overtake me seem to soften a little as I learn to be more accepting of the immensity and mystery of her death. After all, immensity and mystery have been woven into our years together from the very start. I just now shared with Maureen a memory that I've shared with her many times over our years together. The memory is about how deeply affected I was by something Thomas Merton said to us novices not long after I entered the cloistered Trappist monastery of the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky, where Merton, as novice master, was my spiritual guide. He encouraged us to realize that when we die, we don't go anywhere. We don't orbit the earth a few times and take off to God in some far-off celestial realms, for as Scripture tells us, in God we live and move and have our being. All the angels, along with all the blessed who have crossed over into God, are here with us in the vast interiority of God, in whom we subsist as light subsists in flame. See? And then I say that when she died, I was so traumatized by the loss. I would literally walk back and forth here in the living room, screaming out loud, crying. I loved you so much. I loved you so much. I knew this depth was true, but my capacity to live in it was traumatized. But as the months went by, it softened. And so now I'm very aware of her deathless presence. I'm very aware of it, that the body falls away, but who we ultimately are in God is eternal. It's eternal. It never dies. It's unto God. And so I say it. I'm 80 years old, and I'm at peace here, living where we lived for 30 years, the ocean here. And how I put it, I feel old, sad, lonely, fragile, amazed, and grateful. And I also realize at 80 years old, I'm not stuck here forever. I'm next. It's a temporary arrangement. So how I put it, we're here for a very short time, essentially, I think, to learn how to love, basically. So when we're born, I say it poetically, this infinite love exhales us onto the earthly plane. And we live through time learning to love. And in God's good time, infinite love inhales, and it comes full circle back to our infinite destiny in love. And that's how I live my life. Yeah.
Speaking of inhaling and exhaling, your description of the moment of death is very Buddhist, actually. You say the moment of death itself is not an event, but a cessation, meaning the cessation of breath. Like, we breathe in, we breathe out, and at some point we'll breathe out and not breathe in.
That's right. That's right. That's right. I love a saying of the Buddha. A saying of the Buddha was, he said, subject to decay are all compound things. Everything made of parts falls apart. But there is that which is not made of parts, and can you find it? Strive with diligence. See? And that's the essence of all religious consciousness, I think, in its depth, is that.
So now, with all of your life experience, all of your contemplative practice, all of your study, and having not too long ago suffered the loss of your loved one, of your beloved, what do you think happens after you stop inhaling?
Yes. Here's what I think. This is what the tradition teaches.
Yeah.
How I put it is, on this earth, we experience, understand, and respond to God's presence veiled in faith. Like as in a mirror darkly, Paul says. Gabriel Marcel calls it an obscure, a primitive inner assurance. And we learn to live by this faith that God's with us. The measure of this faith is love. And when we die, we live in hope that when we die, we're not annihilated, but consummated. So what happens when we pass through the veil of death, we move from the veiled awareness of God's oneness with us into unveiled awareness. We become as much God as God is God, in our eternal nothingness without God. That's the infinite generosity, of our destiny. To be a mystic is God decides with some people not to wait until you're dead to give you a taste of that. See? That to be a mystic, I think, is this unmediated divinity that touches you, not just as a fleeting moment, but as a calling in your heart to follow it and to yield to it, that it might have its way with you. Being divinized and transformed by love into love. That's my sense of it.
Speaking of the mystics and the Christian tradition, how does John of the Cross's concept of the dark night of the soul fit into the contours of your book, which is about finding transcendence in trauma.
Yes. Saint John of the Cross, Spanish mystic, which we survival 16th century. Here's the way he put it, what he means by the dark night. He says, yes, it's true that God is given to us, mediated through faith, through consolation, through insights, through inspiration and aspirations, and so on. And what can happen is that sometimes God realizes that we become attached to these finite ways of experiencing the infinite presence of God. And so what God does, the dark night of the soul, is God withdraws the capacity to be consoled. He draws the capacity to, in faith, the way he puts it in faith. He says, imagine somebody born blind who's told about the color yellow. He would know through faith the color yellow exists. But because he's born blind, he'd have no essential knowledge of what yellow is. He says that's what God is like. We say God is eternal, God, but we don't know what it means. And therefore, what God does is God withdraws the capacity to be nurtured in our emotions, nurtured in our feelings. And he said, in that absence, in that deprivation, he said, if we don't panic, he said, "O night lovelier than the dawn." He's a great poet. He says to God, he's in the middle of the night. He says, "Where have you gone, beloved, and left me moaning like this?" And he says, "It's not fair that you do not carry off this heart that you have stolen, because I live not where I live." See, and the longing. You begin to discover that this longing for God is an echo of God's infinite longing for you. And little by little, you discover God's the infinity of your longing. And he says, "Oh, night lovelier than the dawn," which is in the spiritual canticle and mystical marriage, is this unitive mystical state for John of the Cross. John of the Cross had a very profound effect on me.
Did he?
His poetry and his teachings over the years, he still does. Yeah, beautiful mystic.
Actually, something you just said, I remember, and I'm not, a diligent student of Western mystical tradition, but I remember reading a quote from Simone Weil, where she said, the longing for God is like, she compares it to two prisoners separated by a wall, but they can communicate through the wall.
Yeah.
And the wall that is the separation becomes the means of communication and therefore communion.
Yeah, I so love Simone Weil, really, as a Jewish mystic, and just her commitment to extraordinary person, her gravity and grace and waiting for God. So touching. And that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And she had some of these deep experiences, Jewish, but in Christian context.
Yeah.
It's about being in a little village, and there was a kind of a pilgrimage. People were chanting and praying and carrying a statue, and she started weeping and fell to her knees. She had these deep. She's an extraordinary woman. So we're going to, turning to the Mystics podcast, I want to have some sessions on her.
Yes.
So I like her.
You mentioned, I forgot to mention in your when I introduced you, that you have a podcast called Turning to the Mystics. And I was going to ask if you're still doing it. Evidently you are. You're still involved with Richard Rohr's center, and you're teaching, presumably mostly online. And I want to ask about the sort of contemporary spiritual landscape, because you've been a part of it for a long time. And, as you know, this is an ongoing interest of mine. And I've written about the effect of the Eastern teachings on Western American spirituality. And one of the things I've observed is something you've been a close part of, which is this incredible growth of interest in the contemplative and mystical aspect of the dominant religion in America, of Christianity. And you've been a part of it. How do you explain, first of all, am I correct?
Yes. Here's how I explain it. It's complex, but here's how I explain it. The Protestant Reformation, Luther, was formed as much by the Enlightenment period as a badly needed reform of the Roman Church. And by that I mean this: in the Enlightenment period is the emergence of science. The emergence of science. And on the emergence of science is turning to scripture as proofs, like proof text. And you can flip back and forth and look at proof text to prove things like proving something. Whereas the mystical traditions would say, if you're even capable of proving it, it's not God. It's because you're proving an idea. And so the Reformation then with proof text, I have a lovely book here called Apologetics in the Eclipse of Mystery. Apologetics is proving it and the Catholic Church joined right in with the Counter-Reformation. They started trading proof texts back and forth. And Karl Rahner, one of the great Catholic theologians of the Vatican Council, he said, what we're all thirsting for is mystagogy. We're searching for the intimacy, the unexplainable, like the divine fire, like the birthing of this fire, like this. So I think we've been so influenced by the science is so important in its own way, but it's a coup d'etat. It's overtaken the longing for intimacy, and you can see it in an atheistic, materialistic. Thomas Merton says some people never see a tree until they're ready to saw it down, and they never see themselves except as lumber yield. See, how can it be useful? How can we think we are what we do? Therefore, the more they do, hence the fear of growing old, the fear of dying. He said a lot of Christians are losing their faith, and they're losing it in church because the Christian tradition isn't teaching its own mystical heritage. And so that's what has meant so much for me with Merton and with Richard Rohr, is rediscovering this. And by the way, when Christians go to that place of mystical union, of oneness, these religions all meet each other. That is, the Buddhist, the Hindu, the Sikh, the whatever, the more they all converge at the center, and they recognize each other. Merton once said, religion, the world will not survive religion based on tribal consciousness.
Right.
But if those who have been awakened in their own tradition by the mystery that transcends the tradition, and they would speak like religio, the true this. And so this is one of Merton's messages.
Yeah. Really. I always say that if you bring religious people together, they may end up fighting. But if you bring the mystics together, they just have a good time together.
Yeah. I love this story. There was a lovely series called The Long Search. And this person spent a month like in Israel on a kibbutz with the Jewish family, and then in France with a Catholic family, and in Saudi Arabia with a Muslim. He went around to all these religions. And at the very end, he shared what it was like being with all these religious people. And he thinks that really if they could all get together at one time in one place, it'd be an argument so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. But if he could gather into one room the people in each tradition that had the most deep effect on him when he was in their presence, put them in one room, there'd be silence and a deep respect for each other.
Nice.
And silence would be more resounding than all the yelling, outside the door.
That's great. All right, Jim, we don't have much time left. I want to come back to the theme of your book, The Healing Path, and any messages you have for our listeners. And I'm going to prompt you with a sentence from the very first page of the introduction that I think is what the book is about. The secret opening through which we pass into wholeness is hidden in the center of those wounds we are most afraid to approach. What do you mean by that? And what advice can you give our wounded fellow listeners?
Yeah, that'd be a good way to end, actually.
And at the beginning.
Yeah, it's the beginning. That's the first paragraph. I put it this way. I say this as a therapist. Let's say you call me, you want to see me for therapy. And for the first session, I have no idea what you want to work on other than the little bit you told me on the phone. But I've done it so much, I already know what's going to have to happen in our time together. If the healing you're hoping for is going to happen, you'll show up, we both sit down, you'll talk, and I'll listen. At a certain point, I'll say, I want to ask you a question, so I understand you. And it's a real question. But the question I ask is such you can't answer without pausing to listen to yourself first. And in that little pause, you're becoming more present to yourself in my presence. See? Then I say it back, are we together? Then I say, I have another question. We pause and we get to a certain place where we'll get next to the hurting place, and we can tell because you'll tear up, see, or you'll change the subject, or you'll laugh when you say something sad. And I'll say, you know, if we don't get close enough to touch it, it festers. But if we move too fast, you'll get re-traumatized.
Mhm.
Let's back off. Let's back off. And how can you learn to approach the hurting place with love and touch it with love till the suffering dissolves in love, and find inner resources to do that? And I have found, this goes to Carl Jung too in the archetypes, that when people really follow that path all the way, when two people are that way together, they're on holy ground together. Another way that I put it on this note is that when we risk sharing what hurts the most in the presence of someone who will not invade us or abandon us, we can learn not to invade or abandon ourselves. That's really true. We can be reparented in love by someone who treats you the way you deserve to be treated from the day you were born. That's true. But what's also true is when we risk sharing what hurts the most in the presence of someone who will not invade us or abandon us, we can come along within ourselves what Jesus called the pearl of great price. You're insensibly precious in your wayward ways. See? And Merton says it is that in us that no one can destroy, no one can diminish it, because it belongs completely to God. And you can't do anything to diminish it either. And when you come upon the jewel of it, like this, you can learn to live by it and to walk through the preciousness of your wounded heart as a healing journey and share it with other people. You know.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Jim. It's always great to be with you. And this is especially great because I get to share you with all the listeners. Listeners, you will do well to Google James Finley, go to Amazon and read his books, especially the most recent, Healing Path, a Memoir and an Invitation, and his audiobooks as well. And I invite you to subscribe to the podcast. I urge you to please tell your friends about it. Listen back to some of the previous ones at your pleasure. And find me at my website, philipgoldberg.com. Please subscribe to my mailing list. I send out useful information, not junk. And we'll see you again next time. Thanks again, Jim. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks for the lovely interview. Beautiful. It was a grace for me. Thank you.